One against the state. The question remains, how has South Africa upheld the rule of law? In the case of former Minister Malusi Gigaba, both himself and the president have stated that this resignation is no admission of wrongdoing on his part. This is despite court judgments and the public protector's report on the minister. So has there been a significant shift from the jubilee year of 1994 to where we are now? This does not in any way exempt the apartheid years, since the country saw the worst human rights violations and atrocities conducted under the auspices of the then government. But in our democratic country, has South Africa upheld the rule of law? Interesting question. And to help us discuss this, we've got Mpumelelo Mkhabela from the Department of Social Science at UNISA. Good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you for inviting.
So it's really an interesting conversation that we've decided to do. So perhaps for your perspective, from your perspective, have we held the rule of law in this country?
Yes, the rule of law has been upheld in this country. There's a huge fundamental shift from the past, the apartheid past, ugly past from where we emerged. And if you talk about the rule of law specifically, we have to distinguish. During the apartheid era, the law had what was called ouster clauses. So in other words, the courts were not allowed to review and set aside decisions of the executive or parliament. The system was designed in such a way that there was parliamentary supremacy. And parliament and the executive obviously colluded. That's why you had so much human rights abuses. People couldn't go to court. If they went to court, the court decisions were undermined by the executive and parliament. Coming to post-94, our constitution is designed in such a way that decisions of the executive and in some instances even parliament can be set aside, reviewed by the courts. And that specifically is that power by the courts to review decisions of the executive and parliament is derived from section 172 of the constitution, and section 173 of the constitution gives courts the power to actually make the law, develop the law, what is normally referred to by lawyers as common law.
Yeah.
So those are it's called a judicial review. So the power of judicial review that's vested in the court is actually what distinguishes South Africa's constitutional democracy from other democracies. So in that sense, we're able to uphold the rule of law.
So if we look at the incident now that we were talking about with our former Home Affairs Minister Malusi Gigaba, both him and the president saying this is not an admission of guilt, even though he has been found guilty in a court of law, he has been found guilty of wrongdoing by our public protector. But that still is not at play here. It's the fact that he was saying he just wants to step away graciously and let the president run the country. Should that be the precedent, or should be, no, I have been found guilty, there is wrongdoing, you need to go?
Well, it's very unfortunate that he's deciding to play politics about something which has become a legal matter. You see, but his comments are irrelevant, basically, because once the courts have decided that in this case, he lied under oath, and the court set aside his decision to make an about 10 around the Fireblade matter. So that was judicial review at its best, where it reviewed, the courts reviewed the decisions taken by a member of the executive and then set it aside. So whatever he says is rhetoric, it's got no effect.
Yeah.
What the courts have decided is what will have effect. So,
will come into effect.
And yeah, that's the essence of the rule of law.
So here's another question for you. So we've spoken about the rule of law, we've spoken about the courts. Let's look at Parliament. And I think that's where the question mark comes in. Do you honestly believe that Parliament has been successful in holding office bearers to account?
No, Parliament has failed dismally.
Yeah.
The role that Parliament was supposed to play in holding the executive to account, it has abdicated that role to the point that we see courts getting involved in doing what should have been dealt with by...
Many saying that our country's actually run in courts as opposed to in Parliament.
Yes, but you see, our system is designed in such a way that to take care of that situation where certain political decision makers, if they are found wanting and they are unable to hold each other to account, the system is designed in such a way that the courts will intervene. It becomes unfortunate because then our politics becomes over-judicialized, if I may put it that way. So where key decisions that should come from politicians end up coming from courts. For example, the Nkandla matter. it should have been dealt with by Parliament.
Yeah.
But Parliament failed dismally because Parliament was conflicted. Parliament is dominated by the governing party and the president comes from a governing party, so they had to protect him politically. But so if Parliament were to function and do its job properly, many of the things that end up in court would not end up in court.
Well, I mean, you bring up Nkandla, I'll bring up Sean Abrams and so on and so forth. There have been a lot of those things, and it takes civil society to take something to the courts. It takes opposition parties to take something to the courts. Whereas, as you say, it is there in black and white, it is there in writing. And yet when it comes to the rule of law on a parliamentary level, it doesn't seem to be implemented. Why? What's the problem? Where does that gap come in?
The problem is it's politics. Our political system, much as it has got all of these advantages that we discussed earlier, of the checks and balances, you know, the judicial review, all of those things are very nice, things that are packaged in the Constitution, but it also has got its own weaknesses. It over-relies on the goodwill of the governing party to do good. And if our parliament runs in that fashion, then obviously people have to turn to the courts to get recourse, because the political system is based on self-interest of political parties rather than the interest of citizens.
Yeah.
So there has to be a discussion in Parliament, actually, about how can Parliament be changed in such a way that it can serve the interest of the people, not the interest of political parties or the interest of party bosses.
And the interest of party politics. And this is where I bring one person in, and I talk about Minister Batibile Dlamini, and I talk about her in a way where I find it difficult, and I think a lot of South Africans also find it difficult to understand how she actually still maintains a position of a minister, where in a court she has been also found to be, you know, not suitable for that role, and also has been found reckless and grossly negligent, also lying under oath, but is still there in a position. And we understand it's a strategic position and a strategic play. But is that good enough? I mean, should that not be enough to say, Minister, it's time for you to move away?
It doesn't, obviously, it doesn't inspire public confidence. In the end, this party interests that are put above the public interest undermines the legitimacy of political authority. In this case, the President, Ramaphosa, has political authority to run cabinet, and he appoints ministers. And he knows full well that somebody like Bathabile Dlamini doesn't deserve to be in cabinet. He knows. I mean, there's no question about that. But the issue is that he is now looking at other political considerations of ANC factions. You know, I don't want to be seen to be purging people who did not support me when I was running for the ANC. So when you take those political considerations and you put them above everything else, then you have a situation where now opposition parties must now go to the court to say, Mr. President, sorry, you can't keep this person in cabinet. The law doesn't allow that. The Executive Code of Ethics doesn't allow that. Yeah. Then when the courts instruct him to act, then he can act because now he feels safe, he can't be seen to be purging because the court said so. But we shouldn't really be running the country like that.
No, and that's a problem. And I just want to wrap up this conversation by asking you the example that our leaders are setting for the rest of the country. You know, we talk about police bribery. We talk about all forms of bribery and corruption that is happening. You know, I'm not talking at the upper levels. I'm talking at everyday life, wherever you go. Bad examples are being set. And does that not talk to the root and the failure of where our society is right now?
Well, it does, but to a certain extent, there's a leadership issue. The tone is set at the top. There's one writer who once said that, look, you can have all the laws in the country, you can have all the regulations and everything right in terms of, you know, on paper, all the institutions in place. But if ordinary people think that at the top, the leadership is eating, then you have lost the war against corruption.
Of course.
So the people must believe that the leadership is honorable, is ethical, and is running the country in the interest of the people, not in their own selfish interest. Then in that way, you've already begun to lay the groundwork to deal with the kind of issues we are raising. The corruption, the bribery, you know, all the petty stuff that happens, it is no longer petty anymore, because if it happens on a massive scale, then obviously it means that our public morality is degenerating.
Yeah. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, but whether it be good or bad, and that's the way it should be run. But interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us to talk about this. And I know that there'll be a lot of people wanting to add their voice to the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. Please do. Mpumelelo Mkhabela is from the Department of Social Science at UNISA, talking to us about the rule of law and where South Africa stands when it comes to upholding this rule of law. The judiciary, good. Parliamentary, however, still a lot of question marks there. Good to have you again. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Let's take a break.